God has a way of blessing the rest of our week. And so the fact that you are here today, let me tell you, I believe that God is going to bless the rest of it. Who is ready for blessing in the rest of it? Yeah. All right. So, yeah, get ready for it. I believe that'll happen. And today we're starting a brand new series that we have called Heaven Come. Everybody say with me, Heaven Come. And we're talking about how Jesus brought heaven down to earth 2,000 years ago, but how God still keeps on showing up, how heaven still continues to come to our lives over and over and over again. How many have experienced God showing up in your life sometime recently? Anybody in this room? You know what? After our first service today, I was talking to somebody right in the lobby who was at our 8:30 a.m. Spanish service, and they told me with tears in their eyes how they had been praying for 2 years to get a completely different type of job where that mother and grandmother would be able to spend time with the grandkids, take care of the grandkids and the whole deal. And she told me that she just received that job after 2 years, and God did an absolute miracle in his life. God shows up in our lives. Does he not do it? And I believe he wants to do it in a lot of incredible ways. And so we're going to be talking about this concept over the next few Sundays. I'm excited about it. And today, the title I've placed for today, we're going to put it up here on the screen, is this: When Prosperity Invaded Poverty. When prosperity invaded poverty. When the riches of heaven, when the riches of God came down and invaded the poverty of this world is what we want to talk about today. And Mary and Joseph, they had been called to go to Bethlehem for the census. The census happened every single one, however often that it happened, and they had to show up to Bethlehem in order to be counted for the census. And so they show up to Bethlehem, and that's where we get to these first verses that I'll be using today. When they show up to Bethlehem, they come into a very unique situation. It's this. It says this in Luke chapter 2, verses 6 to 7. And while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. What's the name of that baby? Anybody know? Jesus. All right, we're not confused. We know who it is. She gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a what? What does it say right there? In a manger. Why? Because there was no lodging available for them. There was no lodging available for them. Let's pray, and I'll jump into this message. God, we are so grateful to you for your presence in our lives, for your goodness to us in every way. Lord, I thank you for every single person that is here today and took this step today of saying, I'm going to show up on Sunday and believe that God has something for me. And God, I pray that you would meet us at that point of faithfulness, and you would minister to each of our hearts. You would challenge us, change us, and do something completely new with each and every one of us. In Jesus' name. And everybody says, Amen. Amen. Amen means yes, or let it be so. So when prosperity invaded poverty. You know, God is the creator of the entire universe. He made everything that there is. And everything that we experience today, right? We believe that he is the maker of all of it. And we experience it because he made it. And what is so interesting to me about this part of the Christmas story is the contrast. And that's what I want to jump into today, is to show this simple contrast of this God who had all the riches of heaven, who developed everything that there is and everything that there has ever been, and the way that he shows up to earth. So we're going to put the verses back on the screen. And I want you to see this. It says, while they were there, Mary and Joseph, the time came for Jesus to be born. And so she gives birth to Jesus, and she wraps him snugly in strips of cloth, and she lays him in a manger. And a manger was essentially somewhat similar to, say, like a horse trough or a feeding trough or something. He was just laid inside of a stable, essentially, where there were animals. By the way, anybody have your manger scene set up already for Christmas? Yeah. And you got the little angels there hanging out, and the little shepherds, and the camel, and the this and that, the whole thing, right? All together, although they were never all together at one time. But okay, how many of you are like, you put 10 of them in your house, like all over the place? You have one in the bathroom, one on the ledge, one in, 2 in each room. The Christmas spirit is not alive yet. Okay, we'll get it going. After service, there's hot chocolate, right? So it'll start. It'll get there. Man, tough crowd this morning, I tell you. I'm messing around, but here we go. So she wraps it, and he's in this manger, and and he is in the manger because there was no room. I want everybody to say with me, no room.
No room.
I was thinking about this as I was preparing this message. How does the creator of the entire universe, how does the maker of all of the space that there is everywhere show up and there is no room for him? I mean, if God wanted to, couldn't he have showed up and said, hey, you know what, we're just going to build a 5-star hotel right here and make enough room for me? Like, if he wanted to, he could have made as much space as he could possibly have ever had, because he's God, right? He is the creator of all the space there is, of the planets, the galaxies, the moon, the stars, the suns, the everything. But when he shows up to a situation where there is no room. Everybody say it again. Say no room. And I want you to see this contrast today, because again, if he wanted to, he could have had all the room he wanted to have. He's God. This wasn't a situation where God shows up and it's like, oh, poor God, like, you know, he could work the situation out. He's God. He could work any situation out that he wants to work out. And so what this shows to us is one simple word. I want to tell you two things that this shows to us. The first one is a simple word. Everybody say the word humility. How many believe that is a good thing? And we get that from the God who humbled himself and came from heaven down to earth. And even though he's the creator of all the space there is and all the room there is, he decided to show up in such a way where there was no space for him. Have you ever dealt with a situation where there was no space for you? You were the odd person out, you know? The teams were getting picked by friends to play baseball or softball or soccer or whatever, or basketball, and, you know, there were 11 people, and you were number 11. So you were the sub on one team, right? You know what I'm talking about? You know, or when you were a kid, and there's plenty of us kids still in the room, you get relegated to like the kids' table, and the adults are sitting at the other table. Know what I'm talking about, anybody? Let me just tell you, if you're young, 15 years old, 12 years old in the room, whatever you are, every adult in this room would rather be at the kids' table than at the adult table, okay? So you're in the right spot. I wish I could return to that table. But the reality is we all know what it means to be in a situation where there is not enough space, not enough room for us. Man, even my kids are amazing, and we live in a house with enough space, but they always crunch in together, and they always sit, I always have enough room, but they always sit close to Evelyn on the couch. So we have this massive couch that can fit like 10 people, and they're all crunched into like 2 cushions in one spot. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Evelyn never has room available, ever on the couch. For that reason, hey, I'm a pastor, so I got to be up front and preach, right? Because you can't preach from behind. But my favorite seat in any room is the one in the back. So go, people in the back. Yeah, that's why Jordan does media. He just sits in the back because you have more space available to you. Anybody know what I'm talking about? The people in the back know what I'm talking about. But I love room. I love space. And so Jesus, here he is. He's the creator of all the space there is. And he shows up and he humbles himself to such a point where he comes and there is no space for him. No space, not even among humanity. He has to go in a stable with a bunch of animals. That is where he has to show up in order to show up to this earth. He chose that. Look at somebody close to you and tell them he chose it for you. He did. If you want some good verses that kind of show the point, Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11. If you're taking notes, you can put that down. Philippians 2, 5 to 11 talks about how Jesus humbled himself and came down to this earth to be present among us. And so this is the first thing, is it shows the incredible humility of God, because God humbled himself, let go of his heavenly world, and came down to earth. But didn't just come down to earth in any location. He didn't show up to a palace. Jesus didn't show up to a big kingdom. He didn't show up to a rich place. He showed up to a manger, to a stable. He brought the riches of heaven to the poverty of earth. And he himself decided to experience that poverty himself. He did it for us. But there's a second thing that is important to me in the context of this story that is really where I want to kind of focus my time today. and it kind of blows my mind, is the fact that God, in all of his divinity and all of who he is, that he showed up into this small little space where there was no room available for him. Jesus took the entire package, the entire packet of who he was, and he fit it into this small little space in a manger, in a stable, where there was no room for him. And what that tells me about God is, look at somebody close to you and tell them, get ready. And it's so important for you and for me. What this tells me about God is that God is a professional at bringing his heavenly riches down to our earthly poverty. That he is a pro at coming into the smallest spaces and invading those spaces and doing the impossible in those locations. I gotta expand on this a little bit. It's so important. You know, each and every one of us, we have impossible situations. How many have had a work situation where you have a boss that you're just like, man, this situation is impossible, and the chances of something good happening are like slim to none? Anybody ever had that situation before, or currently have it? How many have had a financial situation where you're like, man, I don't know how we're going to make it. I don't know how we're going to make it the next month, how we're going to cover this bill, the rent, or whatever. Anybody had that type of situation before? Anybody dealing with it, maybe an internal situation in your life where you're just going, man, something is out of order and it needs to change and I don't know what to do and it seems impossible. I'm stressed all the time, whatever. Anybody ever dealt with that in the room? And you know what? Sometimes we look at the things of our lives and we go, man, this is an impossible situation. The chances of something good happening here are like 1% or 2%. Let me tell you something. God is an expert at showing up at the 1% and opening the door and doing the impossible. Because if God brought the riches of heaven down to a little location where there was no space available, then is God able to bring the riches of heaven down to your little spaces as well? Down to the poverty of our situations where we go, man, there's not enough space for God to work here. God is so big and this is so impossible. God says, don't worry. I am an expert at bringing my eternal purposes into temporary small situations. That is what God is capable of doing. And that is what his verse shows to us, is that God can do that. That there is no limitation on him. You know, I remember being, I do this with my kids every once in a while, but when they're small, you know, we go run around the house. I was doing it with little Daniel, our 4-year-old this week. Run around the house, and he's chasing me, and I'm chasing him. I'm going to remember those days. Some of you still have those days. But you know, we're just running around. And usually what happens is when somebody runs into a room and you're chasing each other, they'll try to close the door and lock it first, right, to keep you out. But if the person running behind is able to just get one part of their body inside the space, right, like their foot just in the doorway, then you are able to keep that door from being closed, and now you have access to the whole room. You see, God, all he needs is a foot in the door. He doesn't need the door wide open. You know, some of us, even in our own lives, dealing with our own souls, dealing with our own issues, we begin to think, well, God, I don't even know how you can work in my life. I still feel like I have so much that is out of order. I'm stressed. I'm distressed. I am unfocused. I am thinking about family, and I'm thinking about work, and I'm thinking about school, and I'm thinking about all these different things. I don't even know how much space I have available for God to show up in. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And you spend so much time focused on other things. Let me tell you something. If all you got is 1% of your brain space for God to show up, he'll show up in that space. If all you have is 2% of your heart space for God to work in, then he can show up to the 2% and then open the door and work in the rest of it. There's something here of why we have that Jesus' words a little later on, way after his birth, where he said, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed. Everybody say mustard seed. Who's ever seen a mustard seed? And this is a preaching for another day, but mustard seed is so small. And he says, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, be removed, and it'll be removed into the sea. Maybe God was up to something when he showed up to a no-space situation. But that little amount of space called a manger was just enough space for God to show up to and to start working miracles in this world. And maybe whatever small amount of space you and I have available to God, we look at it as small, but God goes, well, that's just an open door. And I don't care if it's open by 1 centimeter, but it's enough of an opening for me to enter in and to do something in your life. How many believe that God can enter in and do something in your life as well? That whatever space you have available, God can show up into and do something. Man, if you've got issues with your kids, or kids, if you've got issues with the parents, or you're dealing with stuff at school, you're dealing with stuff at work, or whatever that is, or friendships or marriages, I fully believe that God can show up to whatever small little spaces we have, and He can open the door wide open and do the miraculous in those. And He started 2,000 years ago when He took the entirety of the riches of heaven, encapsulated it in Himself, and He brought it down here to the poverty of earth. You know, back in the early days of the church, they had some debates. They were asking the question, well, was Jesus God or was He a man? They asked, was He God or was He a man? And they had this debate, and people go, no, He was 100% God. So His man was like, that was fake. And then others were like, no, He was 100% man. You know, He wasn't God at all. And then I'm sure there were others that were like, no, I think it's like a 50-50 combination. You know, He's like half and half, you know, half God, half man. Who would that be? Like Thor or something? No, not Thor. No. Who would it be? So somebody. But, you know, half and half. Thor? Yeah, half. But Jesus was, get this, He was 100% man and 100% God. Which means that Jesus is the only one who could bring the totality of His divinity into our humanity. And Jesus showed up in the midst of our humanity. And let me tell you, He didn't just show up 2,000 years ago, but as I've said, and I'm going to keep on repeating, He continues to show up today over and over and over again in our lives. Is anybody with me on that? You believe it, you've seen it. You've seen Him doing it. And however God needs to show up. And listen, man, look at somebody close to you and tell them, you're one of the best looking poor people I know. And tell them, you're one of the best looking poor people I know. Here's our reality. We are all poor in our hearts. We are all spiritually poor. We deal with spiritual poverty. But we have a God who is spiritually rich because He is the creator of all of it. And He's able to bring His riches down into our lives in whatever way He wants to do it. And so He shows up. And while there was no space for Him, and that didn't matter. God didn't need a 5-star hotel to show up in. He just needed a little bit of space to show up in. And that was enough for Him to get started. And it was that start. And this is why we celebrate Christmas, isn't it? Because we are so amazed by a God where so many other faiths or religions would talk about a God that you have to somehow get to. Well, what's the way to get to God? How do you get to Him? How do you show up to where He is? Man, my friends, that is impossible. The story of Christianity is not a story of how we get to God. It's about how God got to us. It's not a story of how we cross barriers to somehow make it to where God is. It's about how God crossed every barrier to make it to where we are. Yeah, it's not about how we got ourselves rich and up to God's level. It's about how God abandoned the riches of heaven and came down to our level with us. Is anybody with me? And so much of our human experience is focused on, and we know this to be true, whether it's work or life or marriage or whatever, is so often focused on, what do I need to accomplish to be accepted? And God comes and says, you don't need to do anything, because nothing you could accomplish could even come close to who I am and what I can do. So I'll do you one better. I'll come to where you are. And that's what He does in our lives over and over and over again. A little while after He was born, He got visited by what we call the 3 wise men. And these men were searching for Jesus, and they showed up. We're going to put these verses on the screen, or this verse. It's found in the book of Matthew chapter 2, verse 11. And it says this, they They entered the house. Everybody say the house. You can already see here that Jesus had a little bit of an upgrade. He moved from a manger and a stable to a house, right? Which is also how we know that the shepherds and the wise men and the angels and the animals were not all together at the same time, right? So they showed up a little bit later. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and everybody say, bowed down. And then it says they worshipped. Everybody say worshipped. So they bowed down and they worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They gave him 3 gifts. Now this is so interesting to me. You see, these wise men, as we know them, are these 3 kings. They didn't show up and bring gifts to Jesus because Jesus was poor. Hear me on this. Now, Jesus was not rich in the human sense. In his humanity, Jesus was poor, just like anybody else is. In his divinity, he was as rich is. But they didn't bring it out of some sense of compassion. These wise men didn't go, hey, you know what, let's go on a trip. Why? We just need to go really far. To do what? Take a few gifts to who? Some poor little baby over there. No, that's not why they showed up. Well, what is the first thing that they did when they showed up? It says, after they saw the child with his mother, they bowed down and worshipped him. A baby, a kid. They didn't come out of a sense of compassion of this baby that had a need. No. They had already known that they were coming face to face with the King of Kings, with the creator of the entire universe. And they were showing up in this place. And they understood something, that they were in the presence of greatness. I mean, who here bows down before a little baby in earth, except like to change their diapers, which we've done tons of times, but that's a whole different other type of bowing down, you know? But who bows down before a baby? Well, these men. Because this baby wasn't any baby. This child wasn't any child. This was the king of the entire universe who had showed up here on the scene and had moved into the neighborhood and had said, I am here and I am present and I am available for you. Come on, give that applause stronger if you're going to give it. And so they show up. Now, these men in their humanity were rich. I want you to see this. This second contrast is proving the same thing, but it's so interesting. In their humanity, they were richer than Jesus. But Jesus' divinity far outpassed any riches that they could ever have in their humanity. So they understood that they were in the presence of a king and in the presence of the one who truly had all the riches. So what do? They bring the best of what they have to offer to him. Not because Jesus needed it, no. Because they recognized that he was the source of all of it. And so they bring it to him. Because that in Jesus' hands is a much better location than anybody else's hands. You see, when God came, he came to invade our poverty with his prosperity. And his prosperity comes in so many different forms in our lives. It can come in the form of relationships where God can bring his blessing to our marriages and to our families. And it can come in the form of God's provision, and it can come in the form of God's healing in bodies. We've had people supernaturally healed in this church, and it happens all the time because God does those things. Amen? He totally does those things. And God can bring that in 100 different ways, 1,000, 1,000,000 different ways if he wants to do it. But one of the biggest ways that God brings this prosperity to our poverty is the poverty in our hearts. As God shows up in the brokenness of our own lives, and he brings the riches of his life to each and every one of us. Which is why he said these words later on. He said, the enemy comes to steal, to kill, and destroy. But I have come to give life and life in abundance. He shows up with the abundance of his life to the poverty of life that I have. And he says, I got some of that for you. You don't have enough on your own. You didn't make it on your own. You can't create it on your own. But I got more than enough to offer up to you. And he shows up to us. And he gives it to us. And so these men recognized that they were in the presence of the actual life giver himself. And so they didn't have to hold on to their gold or hold on to the frankincense or hold on to the myrrh. None of those things needed to be held on to by them because they were in the presence of the God who had made all of the gold and the God who had made all of the frankincense, the God who had made all of the myrrh. And they go, man, there is more from where this comes from. I'm in the presence of the creator of all of it. And so when we show up where God is, when he shows up where we are, then there is a miraculous thing that can happen in our lives and in those moments. I was thinking about how God truly showed up 2,000 years ago. How he humbled himself and how he proved that he is capable of blasting the door open even if there's just a little small amount of space to start with. But he's able to take that small amount of space and to enter in and to do something incredible with it. And I was thinking about that. I was just thinking about how he does that and how he moves and how he operates in our lives. Because so often I have dealt with poverty in my own life. How many of you have dealt with poverty or are dealing with poverty right now in your own life? And in so many different ways. But God brings his prosperity to our poverty in whichever way that looks like. And I just had this thought. I was thinking this. It was the following. God brought his divinity to our humanity. He brought his prosperity to our poverty. He brought the supernatural to our natural. And he brought heaven down to earth. He brought all of who he is to all of who we are. But all of who we are is nothing compared to all of who he is. How many are thankful that they have a God, that you have a God, that I have a God that shows up with all of who he is right here? God could have said, no, I'm sticking up here in heaven. My throne is, pretty comfortable. I've got it going on. I've got all the cable channels I want. I'm God. I make them. I got it good. Why do I need to give this up to show up with a bunch of broken, hurting people that don't have their act together? Well, for the same reason he made us from the beginning. Because he's a God of love. And that same love that created us in the beginning days, the same love that drove him to leave it all behind and to bring his full divinity down to our humanity so we might experience who God really is. And I got to come to the end of the message, but let me just be so abundantly, I hope, clear with you guys. And I said it once, I said it twice, and I'm going to repeat it again. The story of Christianity is the story not of how man makes their way to God, but about how God makes his way to man. And you could search all your life for ways to somehow get to God's level, and you're going to die never having arrived anywhere. And for that we have the graciousness and the humility and the love of a God who left it all to come to us. And I believe God obviously didn't just show up 2,000 years ago. He wants to continue to show up today and every day of our lives. So I want to pray that way today. Would you stand up with me this morning as I come to the end of this message? And before I pray, I want to clearly say something right before I get into this prayer. God can bring his prosperity, God can bring his riches to so many different areas of our lives. He can bring it to the relationships, he can bring it to the jobs, he can bring it to the opportunities, he can bring it to so many different areas. Are you guys listening and with me right now? I can get this. He can bring it to all of that. But where he wants to bring it to first is our souls. That's where he wants to bring it to first. That's where he wants to start. And so today, would you allow him to bring his riches to the deepest parts of your souls and to do what only he can do in that place? Let's pray. God, we are so thankful for you today. We're so thankful for your presence. We're so thankful for your goodness and for all that you have done in our lives. And so, Jesus, today, Lord, we ask you and we invite you to bring your riches down to our poverty, your prosperity down to our poverty and our brokenness. And Lord Jesus, would you move in our hearts and would you do something completely new? If you're here today in this room with your eyes closed for a moment, just a moment of privacy, and you recognize your need to have God's prosperity come to the poverty of your own heart, and you, even if you only have a 1% open space for God to do something, that's enough. That's enough for Him. And if you want Him to show up and do something in your life today, would you raise up a hand or two hands, just in a way of saying, God, man, I'm ready to receive from you today. Would you show up, bring your prosperity to the midst of their internal poverty, whatever it is in their hearts and minds and souls that is going on. Would you allow them to experience the fullness of the life that you have for each and every one of them? That today would be the beginning part of something brand new, totally fresh in their life. That they would experience the abundant life that you have for them, and that your goodness would come into their lives in an overwhelming and a powerful way. Jesus, allow that to be the new reality for each and every one of them today. In Jesus' name we say it and we declare it. Amen and amen and amen. Can we give an applause to God right now? Come on.